All right. Welcome, everybody, to Collective Liberation, Disrupt, Dismantle, and Manifest. This is our local context grounding Indigenous rights session. My name is Tim Rue, he, him. I am part of the Museums and Race Steering Committee. And with me today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alethea Whitman. I use she, her pronouns, and I am co-director of the Incluseum, another member of the Equity Coalition that's come together to put this collective liberation event on.
So the two of us are going to be hosting this session today. We'll be watching the chat, tweeting out some of the discussion. Please do use the chat and the Q&A functions as we go through this session. I believe it does default to panelist only if you're using the chat. So if you want everybody to see it, please make sure you adjust that. But please put in your own information if you'd like to let everybody know where you're coming from today. I want to make sure I give First, before I get to that, I want to make sure I give a special thank you to our participants for joining us today. It's because of them that we're able to actually do this and bring their voices and their message to all of you. We really appreciate their participation. I also want to thank the other coalition project members who have helped put all of this together, from determining the sessions to all of the logistics behind it. There's been a big, massive effort, so thank you to all of them. Also, big thank you to our ASL interpreters today, Scott and Tara. They've been doing an awesome job if you've been watching today, and it's been great to have them here. So if we were in person, we would be taking some time to collaborate with the local Indigenous communities to develop a land acknowledgement specific to wherever we are. But we are spread out across the globe really today. We've got people from the East Coast to the West Coast of the US, Hawaii, Britain, New Zealand, and more with us. So since we are coming with people from so many places, we ask that you please take a moment, reflect on the history, the social circumstances, the personal experiences that bring you to this moment. Consider whose ancestral home occupied where you now reside. I personally am on the land of the Susquehannock and the Piscataway Conoy. Please take a moment to reflect. So, as I mentioned, this is our third session today. There's one more at 6 p.m. Eastern at 3 p.m. Pacific. You'll have to translate for all of the other times around the globe. And with that, I'll pass it over to Alethea.
Great. Thanks, Tim. So just to give you a brief rundown of how the time is going to go over the next hour or more, the presenters with us today, they're going to have about 45 to 60 minutes, and then we're going to end things with a Q&A. As you know, and as Tim said, please do use the chat and share questions as we go, and we'll be tracking them along with the presenters to make sure we'll get to questions there with that Q&A time. If you are on social media, you can follow along with Collective Liberation, hashtag Collective Liberation. A lot of the Equity Coalition member groups are tweeting today, sharing content. So please do join in. And I think now we're going to just introduce our presenters and hand things off to them. But we are joined today by Jane Anderson, Maui Hudson, Janette Hamilton-Pearce, Felicia Garcia, and Corrie Rowe, and they are here to introduce the Local Context Initiative, and that's localcontext.org. And that also includes the Local Context Hub. This hub is planned for launch in July. And a bit of background, they're going to dive deep in. Local Context recognizes the sovereignty that Indigenous communities have over knowledge and data that comes from lands, territories, and waters. Local Context is developing a model that addresses the problem of public domain materials and third-party owned Indigenous content divorced from local communities. Local Context offers a system of digital labeling to intervene in the structural, colonial, legacy of Indigenous erasure. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to our presenters to get us started. Thank you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jane Anderson. I'm an associate professor at New York University in Lenape-Hoking in New York. I'm also a global fellow in the Engelberg Center for Innovation, Law and Policy, and also a co-director of the Equity in Indigenous Research and Innovation Coordinating Hub at New York University. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral and present lands and waters of the Lenape Nations. I want to pay my respects to the elders, to the ancestors, and to the present and emerging leaders of these lands. As an immigrant settler scholar, I do this acknowledgement as part of making visible the ongoing structures of settler colonialism and the violence of settler colonialism. And I do the acknowledgement as part of a commitment to be actively working to, or working against the systemic Indigenous erasure that comes from settler colonialism. I also want to pay my respects in the morning to the Tk'emlúps te Secwépemc Nation and the families whose children were taken from the Kamloops Indian Residential School. And on that note, I want to pass over to Maui.
Kia ora koutou katoa, nei rā mihi kia koutou. My name is Maui Hudson. I'm a member of the Whakatohia Nation, which is one of the Māori tribes in New Zealand. I am residing on the territories of the Waikato Tainui in Hamilton, where I work at the University of Waikato as an associate professor and director of the Te Kotahi Research Institute. I was a founding member of Te Mana Raunga, which is the Māori Data Sovereignty Network, and the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and have been working alongside Jane in the development of the biocultural labels, and also promoting the traditional knowledge labels in roles as co-director local context and co-director of Enrich. So kia ora koutou. Janette.
Kia ora no tātou, ko Janette Hamilton-Pearce ahau, ko te whanau apanui te iwi, he kaiwhakahaere, local context ahau, nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Janette, excuse me, I'm Janette from Te Whanau Apanui iwi, and I'm currently the local context program lead. I am residing in the Ngāti Pukuna Mana Whenua area, and I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for having us. Kia ora, Corrie.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having us. Today, I'm coming to you from the homelands of the Mohican, Paugussett, and Wappinger peoples, just outside of New York City. I've been doing some of the beta testing for the local context hub, and I also work as production coordinator at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. And Felicia.
Haku Maktuka Felicia Garcia, Samala Shumash Ino Ni Kashcho Iti. Hi everyone, I'm Felicia Garcia. I'm Samala Shumash from San Ynez, California, and I'm very happy to be here with you all today. I am coming to you from Tewa territory, Ogopoge Awenge, or White Shell Water Place, which many of you would recognize as Santa Fe, New Mexico. I wear a couple of different hats, but I would describe myself as a museum scholar and educator, and I focus primarily on advocating for Indigenous land acknowledgement in museums. But I'm really happy to be working with the local context team here to facilitate beta testing of the local context hub with Corrie.
So kia ora everyone. Yeah, look, we'll get into this now. So yeah, local context towards a decolonial elsewhere. I think, you know, what we're finding is that there's this shift in expectation and practice. And often I think these moments of change or transition are both scary and exciting at the same time. But they build off a history and a scholarship of people challenging systems in all sorts of different ways. And there are moments where there's elements which can be brought forward, and in lots of ways, that's how we think about this project, which comes about in part from people being more explicit about recognizing, or more transparent about recognizing, some of the inherent problems that exist within data and information infrastructures. And so we know that every Indigenous community has enormous collections of tangible and intangible cultural material, knowledge and data that gets held, was being collected and held within archives and museums and libraries and repositories. And most of the time, this information is missing important information about provenance, about what community names were, about what the right context was. So that information is missing from the record, which is being shared with the public at large. Those communities and peoples are largely not the legal rights holders. And as we're all shifting into this era of digitization, we transition these physical records into the digital realm, and we're embedding those mistakes in the digital lives of the material. And this isn't just an issue for an issue of dealing with historic mistakes, but there's also more research that's being done and completed all the time. And it's introducing new knowledge into these repositories and into museums and into databases, which, if they're not paying attention to how these things can be corrected, just exacerbate the problems. And so one of the sort of the discourses that's emerging recently has been around Indigenous data sovereignty. And this is really a discussion about rights and interests in relation to data. And it's grounded in a foundation of Indigenous rights and treaty rights, intellectual property rights, and discussions around Indigenous research ethics and data ethics. But at its core, the discussions have been thinking about the rights of Indigenous communities to access data for governance. So that's, how do they access information to support their decision-making around their lives? And then as that data is being made available to the public at large, or everyone else, how do they manage the access? What are their rights in relation to governance of data? So can they manage access that others have to the data to ensure that its use is done in a relevant and responsive way? And you'll see here a couple of publications that have come out that, really frame and the initial kind of documents that framed Indigenous data sovereignty. And so while the strongest expression of Indigenous data sovereignty is one where Indigenous communities get to control Indigenous data, and it would be in a position where they could hold it and possess it, have the ownership of it, really in keeping with the OCAP principles, if you're familiar with the OCAP principles. We know that most information is sitting in other institutions, whether it's museums, universities. And so the opportunities for communities to have a say in how that information gets accessed and used now becomes a question of governance. And so the Global Indigenous Data Alliance was part of putting together the CARE principles for Indigenous data governance. It came about in part as we really looked at the sorts of principles that were being used to support data sharing, and in particular the FAIR principles, which we're thinking about how you make information findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And when we did an assessment of the sorts of principles that were supporting data sharing and the sorts of principles that were emerging from Indigenous data sovereignty networks, we realized that the FAIR principles were data-centric. They were about the characteristics of the data itself. And that when you look at the Indigenous data sovereignty principles, they were more about the people and they're more about purpose. And so the CARE principles, as they relate to collective benefit, authority control, responsibility, and ethics, became a complementary set of principles. So we could talk to researchers, we could talk to places that are storing or managing or stewarding data, and say, you know, it's important to be fair and care.
So one of the big problems that Indigenous communities have in relationship to their collections within institutions, as well as collections that are being created now, is around intellectual property law. And when we began this project of local contexts, which began 10 years ago, one of the things that we were really dealing with was that Indigenous communities don't own their cultural heritage within institutions. And this is partly because of the way in which intellectual property law, copyright in particular, has functioned as a tool of colonial dispossession of knowledge. Property law generally functions as a legal tool of dispossession, and that's of course extended into intellectual property law as well. So local context began 10 years ago, and it's really a digital tagging system. There's 18 traditional knowledge labels. Can you move the slide for me, Maui? Thank you. And what you'll see is that they have an icon and they have particular kinds of text that goes with them. These labels have been developed over, as I said, 10 years with communities across multiple countries in a real iterative process of development and testing and thinking through what does it look like to make cultural protocols digital that can travel with data over time and across platforms. So this is an example of 3 of the labels that we have: the attribution label, a culturally sensitive label, and a seasonal label. And I'll talk about the attribution label in a minute. But the labels really allow for kind of nuance around how content within collections should be cared for, whether it should be seen, who should be responsible for it. Really brings responsibilities and obligations back into how that material should be circulated into the future. The seasonal label is a label that connects particular kinds of land-based teachings in relationship to how certain kinds of materials should be used. For instance, some songs should be sung at particular times of year and not others. Some stories should be told at particular times of the year. Bear stories shouldn't be told in winter, for example. And the seasonal label connects land-based teachings to knowledge within a particular kind of archival context. The culturally sensitive label is a label that we developed to really speak to different kinds of sensitivities that might exist around language materials, around material that might have derogatory naming, derogatory treatment within it, just as a caution around how it should be used and how it should be used sensitively with a particular interest in relationship to Indigenous sensitivities. The attribution label is often the first label that communities customize, and this is also important about the labels. The icons remain stable and static, but the text itself is customized by every community. So every community has the right to define the terms of the label. So this is the traditional knowledge label from the Skullits band of the Stolo First Nation in British Columbia. And the Skullits customized the attribution label to literally mean name and place, or in Holkmalum, Squix, Quas, Tek, Tamuk. And you can see in the text that accompanies the label is the way in which the Skullits are using the label, the desire behind using it. It talks about politics, it talks about history, it talks about colonialism, and why they have been excluded from having their name within records, and the role of the attribution label in reasserting those rights back and reasserting that cultural authority back into the records and acknowledging the Skullits.
And so as we've been looking at the labels and thinking about what are the things that they do, as Jane mentioned, they've been developed iteratively working with communities and being put together to meet their needs and requirements. But we can see that they cluster in particular ways. And so there's certain labels that relate to recognizing provenance and ensuring that the connection between the place where the material is and the community is at the right level, whether it's the community themselves whether it's the clan, whether it's the family, those people that have the sort of primary cultural authority for speaking to those items. Also recognize that many items will have relationships with a number of communities, and there might be multiple communities involved or multiple communities might have interest in that item as well. There's another set of labels, and Jane talked about the seasonal label, but there's also ones that relate to gender, whether that's things that are restricted to males or females, or whether things are for community secret or sacred. But those protocols relate to the traditional ways in which that knowledge might have been shared or accessed. And so these labels invite users to respect the traditional uses of this material. And then the final set of labels relates to the things that are being permissioned. And so the community can permission outreach for educational purposes. They can permission or talk about things not being able to be commercialized, or whether they're open for commercialization. So there's sort of 3 levels of provenance, protocols, and permissions, or these 3 functions can be met through the labels. And I just want to show an example here of the Passamaquoddy tribe in the Library of Congress, which is one of the sort of the real, I think, great examples of how the use of the traditional knowledge labels has enriched records and improved relationships between communities and institutions. And it was the one which I came across when I was introduced to the traditional knowledge labels, and started to see really the power of the platform for transforming relationships. And this related to a set of recordings, 31 wax cylinders that had been recorded by Jesse Fuchs on the Passamaquoddy territory as he was trialing this new technology. And so those recordings eventually found themselves in the Library of Congress. And you can see here the record. That was the public record, which was really impoverished. And, you know, outside of the name Passamaquoddy, there's no other information here that relates to that community. There's information about the technology, there's information about the recordings, there's information about who holds the rights, and you know, that's the Harvard University, but nothing else. And so through a process of engagement between the community and the institution, with the support of Jane, they were able to put in place the traditional knowledge labels, but also bring forward a whole lot of cultural knowledge that enriches the public record. And you'll see here what that record looks like now, which is has a lot more depth and a lot more information that gives context to the cylinders and the recordings and what's on them. And so this is, you know, the first part of it. There's a couple more pages of information that comes from that community, which talks about what's on the cylinders themselves. And the community, part of the reason the community felt comfortable with sharing that information with the institution and then with the public was because you can see the traditional knowledge labels very present in this record. The attribution label, as Jane mentioned, that connects it back to the community. The outreach label, which says that this material can be used for educational purposes. And then also a very clear signal that this is for non-commercial use. And so there's this level of enriching the public record, which is, you know, of value to society, of value to the institution. But there's also things that need to happen behind the scenes to allow this to occur. And so there were transformations within the MARC record, so that there were places where the traditional labels could be held, and you see that's in the 540. Still trying to learn how to use this language in the right sort of way, but anyway, that's in the 540 field. Similarly, there had to be changes within the JSON field. So, and this is really significant in the sense that now there's a space for traditional knowledge labels, and these can be put in place for any item within the Library of Congress now. So a project which works with this community, which has great outcomes for that community itself, but has transformed the infrastructure so that this is now available for other communities to use too. And then the other element of this process, which was really, really intriguing for me too, was the locating of the traditional knowledge labels within the rights advisory. And so this, transparent recognition of these rights that the community have, which are cultural intellectual property rights, and that they can sit alongside the intellectual property rights, which are, as you can see, they're held by the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology at Harvard University, but the labels are sitting there alongside them, above them, being recognized as the first rights. And so I think this element of transparent recognition of these Indigenous rights is another key component of the use of the labels.
So what's also been interesting about the way in which the labels get used is they're not just about updating the record or fixing mistakes or addressing erasures within institutional contexts, but also they're being used by communities to leverage their interests in a range of other contexts. And so this is an example from the Penobscot Nation, and really thinking through how the Penobscot Nation could bring their cultural authority into a university context, such as the University of Maine. So this really began with a memorandum of understanding that was signed in 2018 between the Penobscot Nation and the president of the university around how Penobscot interests should be recognized at a university level across multiple domains, from anthropology department to the special collections in the library to the Hudson Museum to having a Penobscot member sit on the institutional review board, and also within the press, the publications. So publications that were about Penobscot Nation needed to go through and work with the Penobscot Nation. So in this MOU, the Penobscot Nation included the stipulation for the TK labels to be part of how future practices and engagement with the Penobscot Nation happened in the library and in the museum context. The other thing that Penobscot Nation has utilised the labels around is starting to think about future acquisition of collections. So we know that we are dealing on one hand with historical collections, but collections are coming into institutions all the time. And so the Penobscot Nation really wanted to develop a mechanism, a particular kind of agreement around how the Penobscot Nation was going to be recognised and was going to be at the table as part of making decisions around how those collections are looked after into the future. So this is an example. So around the labels sit all these other kinds of things, such as particular kinds of agreements, particular kinds of memorandums of understanding, for example. And so in this future acquisitions agreement, you can see that there's an encouragement around the deposit or the transfer of the collection or data in the first instance back to the Penobscot Nation. And if that's not possible, then there are secondary and third steps that then allow for the Penobscot Cultural Authority to be maintained with that collection into the future. And so this is kind of an interesting agreement where the labels are utilized as one of multiple strategies that the Penobscot Nation is deploying for the control and governance of those collections into the future.
And so alongside the traditional knowledge labels, we've also been working to develop bicultural labels. And this in part emerges from a similar interest which communities have in having recognition of their, on getting Indigenous authority over genetic resources recognized as well. And this might seem a little at odds with a conversation about museums, but we have to remember that museums are often places where various items are being stored, which are source materials for research. And because of the nature of those historic collections, it's often an easy place for researchers to access material from places which they might not otherwise easily get to. And so some of the interests, some of the issues, I think, rather, for Indigenous people have been how to have their rights and interests recognised in the sequence data that's generated from these kinds of projects. And in a similar way to we've been discussing with how information gets used and shared by others, how do they get to participate in and collaborate around ethical access and use, and that would happen in ways that are consistent with community protocols. And this is so that when there's value that can emerge from activities in the future, they're in a position to negotiate equitable outcomes from the use of that information, particularly if commercialization is involved. And so in a similar way, we've used the model that was put in place through the traditional knowledge labels and been working with communities, particularly here in New Zealand, about identifying the first set of labels that would be useful for recognizing their interests. You'll see there a provenance label, which functions in a very similar way to the attribution label. And then other labels that are important for this kind of context, including consent verified, a permissioning for research use only, but importantly, a couple of labels here which are thinking about what the future relationship might look like, and that the communities are open to collaboration and open to commercialization. That really invites next users to come and recontact the community to say, how would you like to work together on these activities? And by the same token, another label that recognizes that various genetic resources aren't located only within a single tribal area, and that there'll be other communities that will have interest in them as well.
So one thing that's really important about the label system is that only communities can generate labels. And as we developed the labels and we were working with institutions and we were working with researchers, we really kind of identified that researchers and institutions needed tools to, or needed a mechanism to help facilitate the implementation and the inclusion of labels within the kind of institutional context. So we developed a kind of a parallel system called notices. And notices really allow for institutions to indicate that they're willing to do this work with communities. They are also indicating that they often, staff within institutions understand their collections very, very well, much better than communities do, because it takes a lot of labor to identify Indigenous collections, and they're often very hard to find. So notices help kind of raise that material up, bring it out, make it visible in a different kind of way. So for cultural institutions, we advocate for using the attribution incomplete and the open to collaborate notices in the first instance within this kind of pathway of facilitating the bringing of Indigenous cultural authority back into an institutional context. But we also encourage researchers to start using the biocultural notice and the traditional knowledge notice as mechanisms for the disclosure of Indigenous interests. What this disclosure does is it says, from the first instance, there are Indigenous interests here that will have to be addressed. If they're not addressed now, they'll have to be addressed into the future. And we know that that starts to make for different kinds of conversations and different kinds of partnerships, not only within the research practice and the kind of practice of research ethics, but also down the line when certain kinds of material gets used in future collaborations. This is an example of one of the notices, the Open to Collaborate, being used at Simon Fraser University. This is again, the George and Joanne MacDonald Northwest Coast Image Archive is one of the highest trafficked archives for Simon Fraser University in relationship to images of Northwest Coast communities. And so they wanted to add the Open to Collaborate notice, partly because they also understand that they have really limited attribution and acknowledgement within that photography archive, and they wanted to start the steps to change that and start a process of collaborating with the First Nations in relationship to who's actually in those photographs and where they've come from. This is an example of the open to collaborate and attribution incomplete notices being used within Past Perfect at the Abbey Museum in their online catalogue. They've added the open to collaborate notice to every item within that catalogue, as well as in many instances the attribution incomplete, because they know they have only a partial information in the record, and largely that information has not come from the communities whose material that is. So this is kind of an invitation to work collaboratively to update and improve the record so that Indigenous voices are present. And then this is an example of the Open to Collaborate notice in Geome, which is a metadata database for geological and genetic sequences. And within Geome, they have created a field for the TK and biocultural notice so that a researcher can add that as they're adding their metadata in relationship to a collection. And you can see that there. So on that note, in terms of explaining the labels and thinking through what they do and how they do that work, I want to hand over to Felicia and Corrie, who are going to give you a bit of a demonstration of the Local Context Hub, which we've been building steadily over the last at least year to kind of think through how do you, it's a platform that facilitates the communication between communities, institutions and researchers in how institutions can produce notices, but how that can connect to communities so that they can start adding their labels back into institutions. So on that note, I'll hand over to Corrie and Felicia.
Thank you. So I'm gonna start the process. I'm going to walk us through how an institution or researcher would create a project in the hub and place a notice that could be shared with an Indigenous community. So I have already filled out this project, but as you can see, you enter some basic information, what it is, title, description. These are all optional fields. And then you choose to apply either the traditional knowledge notice, the biocultural notice, or both. And we will save the project. And this is going to bring us to the activity page. These are some active projects that I have going. And what we're going to do is we're going to send this to a fictitious community for the purposes of today's demonstration. So back on the projects tab, I'm going to notify community. This would be to notify community that is already on the hub. There's of course going to be a way to invite communities to the hub as well. So these are communities already registered, and I'm going to send it to the Northwest Nation. And you can type a message, hello, and send. And I will bring us back just to show that on the activity tab, there is a record of that. You see here that it was sent to the Northwest Nation. You see your message, and on the right side, you see the status is unseen. And from here, Felicia is going to share to show what the community sees when they receive this notice and project.
All right, so here is what our sample community's dashboard looks like. The community we created, as Corrie mentioned, was Northwest Nation. And so let me just refresh here, and then on this activities tab, the project should show up. So here is that project, the Northwest Nation basket. And so if I click on show more, there's a couple of options here. And so it asks the question, what would you like to do with this notice? And so there are a few different options. I can choose to acknowledge it. I can choose to let them know that labels are pending, or if I'm not interested in collaborating on this project, I can say no labels pending. And so Corrie just showed you all what it looks like on her end, and it previously said status unseen. And so now I'm going to change it to labels pending and notify. And I also have the option to send a message back to Corrie at the Natural History Museum, just letting her know that we received the project. And then if I wanted to take a couple of days to maybe work with someone from the community to figure out which labels were appropriate, it's helpful to let the institution know that the labels are pending. And so if I go to the labels tab here, Corrie and I have already customized a few labels for this community. The hub is designed to be collaborative. And so if one of us customizes a label, the other one would, or whoever else is a member of the admin or the community with admin privileges can go in and approve the labels. And so I will go back to activity, show more, and now I can choose to apply one of those labels. And Jane mentioned this attribution label earlier, and so I'll go ahead and select that one. You have the opportunity to select multiple labels at one time, but I'm just going to apply this attribution label. There's a description down here below, and then I'll click apply. All right. And so now we're back on the projects tab. We have some information about that project created by the Natural History Museum. And now we can see that the attribution label is attached to the project. And so I'm just going to go back in on the institution side, since I'm also a member of the Natural History Museum, to show you all what it looks like from their end once a label is attached. Okay, so now we're back on the activity tab, show more. Might be on the projects tab. Okay, perfect. And so
You're actually looking at an earlier project, Felicia.
Okay, thank you,
It's the
Corrie.
bottom one there on the projects tab.
Okay, so we click show more, and then you can see that the TK attribution label has been attached to the project. And that's it for our little demo.
Okay, I'm sharing screen again. Okay. I'll get that. Right. Sorry. Yeah, so the demo is good. You can see that there's on the hub, there's places where the institutions can sign in, so they have their own sort of login page and they have their own site which they can operate from, and then that can also then connect through to communities who have their own sort of space. And so you'll see here in this very complicated diagram, which we were trying to get across, you know, a whole range of things, but one of them is in part reflecting that there is some human readability elements. So we know that, you know, in seeing the labels, that people can recognize them. They recognize them as a label that they reflect the preference or a permissioning from the community. And so that becomes, you know, very obvious. You can click on it and see what sort of text sits alongside that. The system, as has been shown in the demo, is one where notices can be applied to material. There's obviously a bit of work that takes place to ensure that those notices can then be visualized within the record. And, you know, Jane's shown examples of where that's happened in other places, but just to try and make that process as easy as possible. And then through the communication with the communities, they can then have the labels come in and take over from those places. The labels themselves, the notices and the labels are also going to have unique identifiers. And you'll see all of those funny symbols on the right-hand side. We were talking about either ORCID IDs, RORs, DOIs. These are all things that are connecting the key people, and you would have seen that in the kind of the project information. We're connecting the material to the institution, to a researcher, and to the community. And each of those elements has something that allows us to connect in with the material that those groups know about the item. So the community knows things about the item, the researcher knows things about the item, the institution knows things about the item, but all of that information isn't necessarily shared together within a single record. But this does help us to connect to all of those pieces. And the part of the intention around the use of notices and labels, and you would have heard this from Jane as she described the application of the notices, really being a visual indicator of an ethical intent. You know, the ethical intent of an institution to work to recognize Indigenous interests, to work in a more equitable manner around how they would govern and present collections. And so the use of we can move the use of those, the notices and labels into other fields and areas of associated activities. And I think all we're showing here is that as museums become a source for research, and then researchers take that material as well and then start to use it in other places, that we want those relationships that have been grounded to be reflected in those places too. And so the notices and labels can be present on journal articles, it can be present in the researcher ORCID records, and it just makes it clear which researchers, which institutions are committed to acting in this ethical manner. And so there's the value, or what we've seen as the value of labeling data and collections, and how it links to what communities have been expressing in terms of Indigenous data sovereignty and increasing their Indigenous control over Indigenous data. And so by recognizing the provenance, it creates a connection that enhances the ability to control and be involved in governance. And so by recognizing the rights and interests as metadata, it engages researchers to provide, you know, clear details about where the data comes from and who next users can engage with in the future. And that also supports institutions to establish appropriate relationships with communities and have them become more participate more in issues around control and decision making. The protocol element of the labels is really an educative one that enables worldviews to become present within the infrastructures that we've created, or that are created by the institutions. And it helps to educate user publics and limit inappropriate and derogatory use. And it also provides a way to support institutions and researchers to engage in proper care and application of Indigenous rules for knowledge sharing. And the permissioning part is really about responsibility and transparency as the institutions become facilitators for other activities. And it makes transparent to next users Indigenous expectations and intentions around use and engagement, but also it can also support the development of data access or use policies and agreements, which institutions need to put in, or might need to put in place to enhance their relationships with different communities.
So thank you all. Thank you all for listening to our presentation. If you want to know more about the Local Context Hub, you can contact me on my email. You can also follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Local Context. If you go to Twitter right now, there's a question up there from the presentation. In your opinion, how does local context manifest the rights of Indigenous communities' data sovereignty with museums? So there's this really overall excitement from Indigenous communities and museums to connect and collaborate at a real deeper level than ever before. So this energy, this is new energy. We're manifesting new energy here and possibilities and unlimited for museums and Indigenous communities. So if you go to Twitter, you can follow us there and answer the question, in your opinion, how does local context really manifest the rights of Indigenous communities and their data sovereignty with museums? So we're ready now to take any questions if there are questions available.
And folks can feel free to put questions in the chat or the Q&A section as we're going along here. So there's one question here asking if some institutions might drag their feet about using this tool due to fear about having communities ask for objects to be returned.
Jane, is that you?
I think that they're going to be the hard questions. Communities are going to ask for material to be returned because the material that's in institutions was not necessarily collected on equal or equitable terms or was stolen. So that is going to be something that institutions must confront. And there is no decolonial anything unless you're addressing that particular history and legacy of why those items are in an institution in the first place, and understanding that there's often really poor documentation that supports how those items have come into the collection, from whom, and also even the way in which the particular kinds of transfer of ownership of those collections has occurred under particular kinds of conditions of duress. And that is everything that comes with that is what an institution needs to take on and address to even think about having a decolonial future.
I think one of the things that I really like about the labels is it provides a kind of a bridge into those conversations. So, you know, I think there's a number of institutions that will be anxious about even engaging with communities because of the possibility of that request. Whereas, and often they don't feel like there's anything that they could do other than say no. Whereas in being able to engage with the communities and provide something that does start to head towards, you know, a more explicit recognition, it means that they can build towards those sorts of conversations. And I think that was the really good example that Jane showed with the Penobscot Nation, where now in their relationship, they have a whole series of steps that could be applied for future acquisitions. Doesn't mean that everything will automatically go back, but at least they can have a conversation and work out what is the appropriate place. And you know, that will reflect a much more mature relationship between an institution and a community to be able to work through those things.
There's another one here in the chat. This question is quite different in a way from your extraordinary work that you shared, but I wondered with the popularity of non-fungible tokens, NFTs, and other crypto assets lately, has this shown up with Indigenous data and cultural material in museums? And if so, how might they be protected?
Do you want to do that one, Maui?
Not really. Thanks. Yeah, so we know that there. Yeah, I think we understand that there is a definite relationship between the digitization of material and how that makes it easier to become a part of essentially a kind of a commercial environment, and that there's tools that are being developed like NFTs that are starting to think about, you know, how that kind of commercial activity can be appropriately, I guess, you know, sort of worked through in that environment. There'll be a transitioning element, and you'll know that with the open to commercialization labels, it's sort of anticipating that is you know, one of the future possibilities which communities might engage in with people that are heading in that direction. I haven't seen any examples, or haven't got any examples which we can talk to about that happening, but there's definitely conversations around that people are thinking about how they might best deal with that sort of transition from the rights recognition space into the actual protection as we move into commercial activities arena.
This next question, our person asks, our institution has a lot of holdings of the Mississippian culture. I'm wondering how this site might work with a group that is the ancestors of many living communities today.
So I'm not quite sure I fully understand the question, if that's not knowing who the communities are or knowing that there's multiple communities. I think that one of the things that the hub does, or certainly what the labels do, is allows communities to identify multiple interests that might be with particular kinds of material. There is a multiple communities label that recognizes that there are different kinds of obligations and multiple obligations that might exist around, for instance, a song series, or around particular kinds of ways in which certain materials should be used. I think the other thing that we're building into the hub is we often know that institutions don't know or don't have connections to communities that they would like to be working with. And so part of the role of the hub is to help facilitate those connections to multiple communities, that they know that they have collections, but they don't necessarily know the community's names or where they are. And so that's kind of part of the work that the hub will be doing, whereas we add a kind of a GIS component to helping communities identify what their territorial and land interests are, and therefore that will facilitate institutions being able to work with those communities into the future.
The next question on here, could you chat a little bit about how you all got organized and also continue to stay organized as this project continues to unfold? They would like a bit of the nuts and bolts perspective about how you collaborate.
That's a great question. We collaborate across 2 countries at the moment, in really different time zones. Originally, the labels were developed in a very, very small group, but just working directly with Indigenous communities and responding to questions around how can we be at the table to negotiate the use of our collections if we don't have any legal rights. And that was really done on a community to community basis. And then that started to build into this kind of larger project that has maintained Indigenous partnerships in relationship to the development of the labels. How we've come together as a group is much more recent. I wonder if Maui and Janette might speak a little bit to that, and then also Corrie and Felicia could speak a little bit to that as well.
Yeah, so I met Jane probably 3 years ago as I was sort of directed towards her work in the context of the sort of discussions we was having around Indigenous data sovereignty, and what sorts of mechanisms were out there that might support greater Indigenous control of Indigenous data. And through that collaboration, also thinking about how it would apply into the kind of genetic resources sense. So there has been this component of that's still sat in that development phase, and I think we're really now, there's 10 years of development work which Jane's primarily done, working directly with communities, which has meant that we're sort of transitioning from it being a research project into actually a project around implementation and uptake. And that's where we've started to have to move into thinking about where can we get the sorts of resources to support that activity, but also how can we build both the infrastructures in terms of the digital infrastructure with the local context hub, but also the physical infrastructure, the people that can help do the work, so that we're in a position to scale this up and make this available to more communities and more institutions than Jane can go to in a year. So that's how we've moved, and where we've been able to access resources to support Janette and Felicia and Corrie and others to get involved. So Janette is the lead, is the one that's really got the job of trying to coordinate us, and she does a great job. But you can talk about how that happens.
So the nuts and bolts really of the organisation is using the technology as much as possible. Information systems is my background, so I use project management tools like ClickUp and communication tools like Slack to have everybody all in the one place and us talking to each other all the time, making sure that we all kind of have a place for our own voices and a place that we are getting tasks done in project management tools. So the nuts and bolts really is around using the technology, automating as much of everything as possible, and from design, development and beta testing, where Corrie and Felicia are doing the fabulous work of testing at the moment. So Corrie, did you want to add anything?
I think you covered it per usual. Janette always covers everything in a fantastic way, of course. Felicia, maybe?
Sure, I will just jump in and add some information about why I got involved in this project. I think we all have many different projects that we're working on outside of local context. But I met Jane when I was a master's student at NYU in the Museum Studies program, and we worked together to develop a guide to Indigenous land acknowledgements for cultural institutions. And I continue to do a lot of work related to land acknowledgements, spreading awareness and advocating for museums to adopt the practice. But I always, emphasize the fact that land acknowledgements are not decolonizing, and they really are just a first step within a larger decolonial framework. But a lot of times institutions have questions about what does that look like? What is a larger framework? And I think that local context and the labeling system offers an example of, one of those next steps towards creating equitable, respectful, mutually beneficial relationships with Indigenous communities.
All right, thank you. So connected to the question about how you're all organized there, this next question asks, could you talk more about your community partners and how involved they were in developing and iterating the amazing tools you've created, and how you are evaluating the project?
Sure, so I'll start and then I'm going to hand it to Maui to speak a little bit about community partnerships and development of those out of a New Zealand context, and then to Corrie and Felicia to talk a little bit about how we've been doing the beta testing in relationship to the hub with community partners. But the project really began partly because of all the work that I've been doing on intellectual property and cultural property and the problems that communities have, and would constantly be asked into community context to either do some negotiations between community and an institution, or say, for example, in the instance with the Penobscot Nation, to actually develop particular kinds of tribal policy or tools that could actually leverage community interests in a variety of contexts. And this then led to the development of the labels and working really closely with a variety of communities that would look at the labels, think through what the terms of the labels were. Does that work across multiple community contexts? So then thinking about, you know, a community might develop the culturally sensitive label, but it has to work across so many different contexts. And so it would then get tested with different community partners in different parts of, in a different part of the world. Then it would come back, and then we kind of iterate around what the text looks like. And then communities would customize those labels. So that was, I mean, that's why it's taken 10 years to get to this point, I guess. It was not fast work. It was very slow, very deliberate, and very attentive to a range of issues about kind of what collaboration and partnership looks like, as well as then what that starts to be as you kind of start to scale into really different contexts. And so we often have community partners and community members kind of speak about the process of developing labels and kind of what that means from their standpoint in other kind of contexts, which has been really important in terms of sharing that information. Maui, do you want to speak a little bit about community partnership within Aotearoa and the kind of New Zealand context?
Sure, and so that becomes, you know, one of the questions as you sort of enter a new space, is that, you know, where has this emerged from? And when it emerges from a kind of another international context, and you bring it into a local context, people's you know, I guess in some ways concerns about whether it's fit for purpose. And I think what we've found, or at least through the conversations which we've had, is that the labels meet the need. You know, and all of those issues that we described at the beginning of the talk about, you know, some of the challenging projects, those are common challenges faced by communities all around the world. And then there's do the labels and the protocols that are reflect someone else's community, are they also consistent with our own? And so that's the process we're in at the moment, where here in Aotearoa we've got three tribal communities that are piloting the labels, and it's really us just testing that you know, are these you know, permissions and these ways of thinking about provenance and protocols also consistent with the sorts of ideas or things that we would like to put in place from our context. At face value, it is, and that's why, you know, people have agreed to do it based on what they've seen. There may be some nuances that emerge, and it may require the development of new labels to meet the community's expectations. But, you know, as James talked about, that's an already sort of key component of the system as it is, and doing that into the future is just you know, quite possible.
Felicia, do you want to talk about the community beta testing? And I can also add about the other side of beta testing.
Sure. So I've been working with Corrie and Janette as well. We've been a very collaborative team here, reaching out to different folks and communities who Maui and Jane have already made connections with. And we've invited them to participate in the beta testing process of the site. And most of these communities and testers already have familiarity with local context and are interested in applying the labels in the future once the hub is up and running, or if they have previously applied the labels using Moker2. And so Corrie and I and Janette work together to schedule one-on-one sessions with representatives of different communities, and Corrie will talk a bit more about the work she does with institutions and researchers, but it just helps us to get a sense of what folks' initial impressions and assumptions are of the site. And I think doing it one-on-one is really important, so that I feel like folks have the time and attention that they all deserve. And I think that all of these contributions will be really valuable in shaping the site. And so we're just finishing up our first round of beta testing, and then we'll be going through all of the feedback and reporting back to the team. And so, yeah, I'm just excited to see how the rest of the process goes.
Yeah, and just to add that I think collectively it's something like 36 community institution researchers we have had walk through the site. We've gotten some great feedback because we do want to make this both easy to use, intuitive, and not become burdensome for anybody involved. So we've had really great response, and the site is work in progress. So next time you see it, might have some new features. We'll see.
All right. We also have a concern here. I'm concerned about the capacity to implement this system of both the small institution, I work at a historic house, and more so the capacity of the Indigenous culture bearers we work with, who are frequently overburdened with providing for institutions. What are the panelists' thoughts on that?
I think that's a great question, or great concern. We also have that concern. In fact, partly the process of developing the hub is to alleviate those particular capacity issues, from smaller institutions to, you know, first and foremost, though, it was to deal with the hidden labor or the unseen labor that Indigenous communities have to firstly find their collections, then to establish relationships with staff at institutions, and then to negotiate return or to negotiate engagement in care of those collections. And that was kind of one of the ways in which the hub will function, is that communities will be able to directly engage with multiple institutions rather than having to kind of set up and do all the enormous legwork that's required on one hand, but also once a community has developed their suite of labels, they'll be able to send them to those institutions really quickly. So again, allowing for and facilitating a different kind of connection, but also really targeting the way in which the capacity that communities have to engage with, for instance, 50 institutions that have their cultural material. So we're kind of, that's what the scaling of the hub facilitates, is that different kind of engagement with, you know, with attention to what communities can do, but also smaller institutions. And partly our job is to make that as easy as possible. Our function in the hub is to provide like an open API that allows for the labels to quickly come into institutional systems, regardless of what those systems are, as well as to create permanent identifiers for each label and each notice that allows them to be tracked and traced over time, so that we know who's added them and when and why, and to facilitate that connection back to community into the future.
All right, well, with that wonderful response, we're about at our time with this session. So we just wanted to extend a deep hearty thank you to Corrie, Felicia, Janette, Maui, and Jane for being here and sharing your work with local contexts. We hope that everyone visits your website, follows you on the social media platforms you're on, and really engages with the work that you're doing and tries to find ways to adopt it and engage with it. There are so many entry points to get started. So I want to thank you all for that work and supporting that in an ongoing way as well. So yeah, with that, thanks everyone. Thanks all of those who have participated and shown up to participate and ask questions during this session as well. And I hope you all join us at the next session and have a good rest of your day.